We have Edward Lush here today. He is the head of energy and transitions for Project Canary. He's responsible for the midstream strategy, business development, and revenue growth. Before joining their team, Edward worked for MarkWest Energy Partners, a publicly traded midstream natural gas company, and then for MPLX, a subsidiary of Marathon Petroleum, following MPLX acquisition of MarkWest. During his time at MPLX, Edward held various commercial roles and most recently led business development efforts for all of MPLX's gathering, processing, and fractionation assets in the Marcellus and Utica shales. Edward holds a JD from Washington University School of Law in St. Louis and an MA in Geography and International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in the UK. So please join me. Edward, come on up.
Thank you.
I think you just have to push a button to activate it. Yep, then you go left to right. There you go.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, and good afternoon. Whoops, let me go back to, okay. So I'm going to talk about a few emerging trends in the natural gas industry, namely certified gas and what some are calling the measurement economy, and provide some context as to what that means for midstream companies. So I realize I'm all that stands between you and cocktail time, so I'm going to keep this brief and high level, tip of the iceberg type stuff. So really just to pique your curiosity and give you something interesting to talk about when you're waiting for that. Is it the 20th draft pick tonight? So with that, we'll jump in. So before you beat me up for, hey, we don't have above ground pipelines in Appalachia, I knew I was the final presenter of the day, so I just wanted some interesting pictures. And I thought this was a good picture of natural gas infrastructure in harmony with the climate, and frankly, more interesting than a buried pipeline. So you've probably seen plenty of announcements out there about upstream companies, producers announcing that their gas is being certified, responsibly sourced gas, many different names for it. And what does that really mean? I personally don't like the term responsibly sourced gas. Gas operators are all the responsible to begin with, so I prefer the term certified gas. So what does that mean? So certified gas is geologic gas, but the production and transportation has been certified to have low environmental impacts. So namely, that means methane emissions. The certifications focus on other environmental components as well, water being a big issue in Colorado and the West, looking at land impacts and community impacts. But essentially, you're looking at the operations, the engineering, and certifying how the gas is produced and transported. So certification with monitoring is becoming the standard. So some companies are having their operations certified without monitoring, but continuous emissions monitoring at the well pad is becoming the standard. And that's really being driven by European LNG buyers and then utilities in blue states, who really want to be able to track and differentiate the methane intensity of the gas they're buying for their operations. There's premiums in the market, or at least there were premiums when the responsibly sourced gas market began to develop, anywhere from 2 to 10 cents. Those premiums are probably gravitating down as there's more production that is being certified. The premiums come down. And we certainly view the marketplace developing quite rapidly with respect to certified gas, to the point that certified gas for some applications, utilities, LNG buyers, may become the standard, and if the gas isn't certified, it may trade at a discount or be purchased at a discount. Transactions can occur through traditional NASB forms with an addendum that sets forth the terms of the deal, and then through digital registries, which is an emerging area in the certified gas market. So what are digital registries? It's really a way to track the environmental attributes of the gas that's being bought. So 1 MMBTU of natural gas, giving more visibility to who's buying it, understanding that it's not just a gas molecule, but it's a gas molecule with a certain methane intensity, with a certain water impact, community impact, land impact, really giving the buyer more visibility into the gas they're buying. And why is this important? This is important as we look at where regulation is going, increased disclosure around Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. The users of gas are increasingly going to want to be able to differentiate the gas they're buying. Not all gas is created equal. If they can say we're buying cleaner Marcellus produced gas versus perhaps Bakken associated gas, that's the intention. So the RSG market context, just to let you know kind of the magnitude of the market we're talking about. So our goal at Project Canary in terms of certifying gas is to really enable the long-term viability of the gas industry. So as you see the gas industry be under pressure from alternative energies, different forms of energies, environmental NGOs still not liking gas, the idea is to bring more trust, transparency to gas production and really validate the responsibility, the prudency that operators are already demonstrating to help you walk that walk with operators. So right now, approximately 20 BCF a day of gas is certified. There's negotiations under place or certifications underway. So by the end of 2022, that market will probably be up to 40 BCF of gas, so almost 40% of the gas market, and growing. So the market is really being driven in two ways. It's being driven by regulation. So every regulator out there, in some form or another, is talking about enhanced emissions disclosure or regulation. EPA with a methane rule, SEC with their climate disclosure proposals, FERC with their policy statements, PHMSA, DOE, various states, as well as the market itself. So the actual buyers of gas, again, are wanting to understand, have more visibility into the environmental attributes associated with the gas they're buying. We're seeing this from LNG buyers, particularly European LNG buyers, and we'll discuss a lot more about that in the coming slides, but then blue state utilities as well. So utilities in the blue states who realize that renewables, unreliable, expensive, they still need to buy gas, but wanting to prove that they're buying the cleanest, the greenest, the most organic gas on the market. So in terms of regulation that's driving the marketplace, the SEC climate disclosure, it's just a proposal, it's subject to comment, but it's going to have a real impact on the development of the market, in my opinion, in Project Canary's opinion. And I think it's an opportunity for the natural gas industry in terms of having that playing field leveled a little bit, in terms of natural gas companies being the only companies that are really under the microscope to reduce emissions, to report emissions. But people are buying that gas, people are using that gas, tech companies in particular, very electricity intensive, very high emissions profiles if you look at how much electricity it takes for the data centers. So the SEC climate disclosure rules in terms of scope 2, I think are really going to put the magnifying glass on some of these other industries that are very electricity intensive, and when that electricity is coming for gas, really drilling down into, okay, what's the source of that gas? What's the methane intensity associated with that gas? So it's going to be interesting to see how this rule develops. It's been proposed right now, it's subject to comment. It's going to roll in over the next few years depending on the size of the company. But ultimately, it will probably be nipped and tucked, but ultimately, it's coming. So Tom, our prior speaker, spoke about the macro situation. And what's interesting is while there's this focus on emissions, heightened focus on emissions, there's also this realization that the world isn't ready to move away from gas, or the world is entirely reliant upon gas. And this has been highlighted by the tragic events with Russia and Ukraine that has really shone a magnifying glass on a situation that was already well underway in terms of hot summer in Europe last year, cold winter, lack of investment in infrastructure, Russian pipelines holding back gas maybe as a way to pressure Europe into approving Nord Stream 2. But this was all underway. And you can see some of the headlines up here. People's initial reaction was, we need more renewables, we need more coal, we need nuclear. And the solution is staring everybody in the eyes, which is LNG. Really, let's export more LNG. Gas is the cleanest, most affordable, reliable form of energy out there. So right now, Europe imports approximately, through pipeline, about 15 BCF a day of gas from Russia. That's all 27 European countries. So as the previous speaker mentioned, currently operating capacity, LNG capacity in the US is about 13 BCF a day. And authorized under construction, another 10 BCF a day. So under development, there's plenty of LNG infrastructure to meet the global call for gas, not just Europe, but as the Indian economy continues to expand, as you see China and other countries that are very reliant on coal, looking to try to meet their carbon reduction goals, debatable how serious those countries are, there's going to be increased demand for LNG globally, not just from Europe. So in terms of everything that's in front of FERC right now, there's the potential that 5-10 years' time, 50 BCF a day of LNG capacity. But what's it going to take to get there? So this is an article that the Rocky Mountain Institute put out, and it talks about which gas Europe imports now has a dramatic impact on the climate. And this is something I think all of us in this room, upstream, midstream companies need to think about. It's all well and good the US talking about we're the gold standard, we're going to be who fills the need, the global call for gas, but it really needs to be proven in the sense of what the emissions profile is of US gas compared to Qatari gas. Australia is a big exporter of LNG, but almost all their LNG goes to China, China, South Korea, Japan. So I didn't put Australia up here. But if you're looking at, this is again from that same Rocky Mountain Institute article, we can, not my calculations, we can debate the numbers in this, if it's really apples to apples, apples to orange. I think it says in small writing, maybe it's on the next slide, it was somewhere in it that they're comparing US gas produced in the, oh, there you go, yeah, East Texas and Arcomas. They're not looking at US LNG, Marcellus LNG, Haynesville LNG. They're looking at some basins with higher emissions intensity. But this is the general picture, that if you're a German buyer and you realize our renewables aren't working, we need LNG, where are you going to buy that LNG from? And that really, when we talk about the measurement economy, really needs to be proven that measured emissions from US LNG, it's cleaner than Qatari LNG or any other country out there, if you're really going to get to that 50 BCF a day level of LNG capacity. And this is the dirty Russian secret, right? I mean, Germany, Europe has been very active in advertising its renewables and how much wind, how much solar they have, but that's all premised on Russian gas. And this chart really puts, again, same article, puts into perspective how much more problematic from a climate change perspective Russian gas is. And this has all been kind of smoke and mirrors, and Europe hasn't been terribly transparent about it. The Russian situation, I think, is really drawing attention that as a path forward, is it going to be Russian gas? Again, understand that it's not a friendly regime, and looking at what the true emissions intensity is of that gas versus US and Qatar. And assuming these numbers are correct, you can see that Qatar actually, again, East Texas, Anadarko, or Arcoma, sorry, Qatar seems to have the advantage. So one interesting thing Europe is looking at doing is a cross-border carbon adjustment tax. So essentially levying tariffs based on the carbon intensity, the methane intensity of gas they're importing. So to the extent that US LNG has higher methane intensity than Qatari LNG, that's going to be hit with a higher carbon adjustment tax. It's going to be more expensive. It's going to disincentivize European LNG buyers buying US LNG. So it's a real incentive for everybody involved in the gas industry to focus on, and we've had some great talks today about things the industry is doing, already underway, what the industry can do to keep driving emissions lower and lower and lower. But this is the problem the industry faces right now. And again, these aren't my numbers. When it says actual, I'm not saying that's true, that's just what Kairos has measured. So the blue is what is estimated, what companies, this is producers, what companies report to the EPA from various different basins as their emissions. And then the, I don't know, what color is that? Orange, yellow, something like that. That's what was quantified through a flyover at a period of time. So you can see in some of these basins what is being measured as opposed to estimated is purported to be close to 10 times higher. So what measurement do you use when you're talking about a carbon border tax? Which gas is cleaner? What do you use? Do you use EPA estimates, or do you strive for some form of measurement? So the type of monitoring matters. This is somewhat self-serving because at Project Canary, one of the things we do is install continuous emissions monitoring. All forms of monitoring have an application. I'm not going to degrade anything, but the highest accuracy, the most frequent, the type of monitoring that's going to give you the most actionable real-time data is stationary continuous emissions monitoring. Obviously, that's easier to do in the upstream when you're talking about monitors on pads. In midstream, when you're talking about dispersed infrastructure, thousands of miles of pipe, you're probably going to install continuous emissions monitors where it makes sense, highest points of emission, namely compressor stations, processing plants, and then you'll probably look at flyovers or other ways to measure, quantify emissions at other infrastructure throughout a gathering system or on a pipeline. So right now, environmental NGOs are using a lot of drone, satellite. EDF has reported, the Environmental Defense Fund have reported they're launching their methane satellite up into space. That somewhat scares me. If they're flying over facilities and they're measuring from space what your emissions are, how do you defend yourself? Are you going to say, here's my estimated emissions? Or is it time for the industry to be a little more proactive and say, I'm going to actually put emissions devices out on my facilities, going from a defensive, reactive posture to more of a proactive, offensive posture. And I know this firsthand in terms of, and Rob McHale over here, we spent some time together in the trenches back when MarkWest was building its infrastructure. You would go into townships, and there was this lack of trust as to what your emissions were. And people would say, prove it. And we didn't have continuous emissions monitoring devices. Well, why aren't you installing those? Do you have something to hide? So at Project Canary, that's one of the things we're trying to do is build that trust and transparency. And yes, monitoring comes at a cost. And monitoring, it may create data that you think we have a leak somewhere. Well, then you should go fix it, right? It's time for the industry to step up and really prove what, frankly, everybody in this room does already in terms of being a responsible, prudent operator. But continuous emissions monitoring is a way to just tell that story a bit better, as well as globally when US gas is trying to compete with Qatari gas, dealing with carbon adjustment, border taxes. It's just a way to help tell that story and maintain the long-term viability of the industry. So leakage isn't just an upstream problem. This is a article that was put out by EDF with Carbon Tracker. They flew planes and flew over some sites in the Permian and observed what they called numerous so-called super emitter facilities. The majority of those were well pads, but there are a number of compressor stations and other infrastructure on gathering systems that they identified as super emitting facilities. So I know sometimes in midstream, we try and point the finger and say it's more of an upstream problem, but the bullseye is on midstream too. Everybody's invested in this to try and reduce emissions to the extent they can. So we had a bit of a discussion earlier about FERC, and I'm not going to go into the environmental justice side of it, but if the US really is going to get to not even 50 BCF a day of LNG capacity, 30, it's going to take a lot of new midstream infrastructure to get that. Pipes out of Appalachia are full. I don't know if anybody's brave enough to try and build another Appalachia to Gulf pipe, probably not, but Haynesville pipes, Permian pipes, if you're talking potentially Penn LNG, a gas pipeline out, some of the infrastructure needed in that area. The FERC policy statements, the initial reaction from the industry, and this is me just being a bit provocative. I challenged these things when I was in my prior role, but the initial industry reaction was, this is terrible, we don't want to do this, it's costly, right? And I put a quote up there for Chairman Glick, who's a Democrat, but his view was, if we're going to ensure the durability of the orders and protect the FERC process from being challenged through litigation, then maybe making it more robust is a good thing. This is a great example. I mean, Mountain Valley is a true cautionary tale. Pipeline that unfortunately is a number of years delayed, billions of dollars over budget now, designed to shift more gas down to Virginia, I think, and the Carolinas to offset coal with gas. Good environmental plan behind it, but it's just been stuck in a quagmire of litigation. And you're never going to appease the environmental NGOs, but when FERC has a policy that maybe isn't as robust as it could be from an emissions perspective, from an environmental impact perspective, it leaves, frankly, their approvals open to these type of challenges. And this is what's happening with Mountain Valley and some of the other, ACP being a good example, Atlantic Coast, some of these other pipeline projects, they're really the target of NGOs. And if more midstream infrastructure is needed to meet the global call for gas, to get that gas to the LNG facilities, then maybe we need to think about how can we work collaboratively with FERC to meet them halfway, come up with a rule that the industry can live with, some form of greater monitoring, some form of greater environmental impact, and see if there's value there. So just, again, me being a bit provocative and just food for thought. So changing tactics a little bit. In the certified gas space, in the emissions reduction space, there's various market-based and government-based mechanisms to try and incent people to reduce emissions. So something I didn't know before I went to Project Canary and started playing in this area is really the difference between carbon credits and carbon offsets. You're probably all a lot smarter than me. You probably already know this, but I thought I would just go through it very quickly. So the carbon credit market it's government mandated. The government says, we're going to issue you X amount of credits for the emissions that your business is producing right now, and over time, we're going to take those credits away. So you need to reduce your emissions. And cap and trade being a good example of the market government mandated incentive, if I can reduce my emissions ahead of the reducing credits, I then have credits to sell. I can sort of monetize my emissions reduction and sell those credits to a company that isn't reducing at the same rate I am. And the punitive piece of this is there's, in many of these states, a carbon tax. If you don't reduce enough, you can't buy credits, you then pay a carbon tax. Offsets are a little bit different. Offsets is a purely voluntary market. So when we're talking about net zero, this is the carbon offsets that when companies have reduced their emissions to as low as they can go, they then buy offsets. So offsets is a little bit of a, it's a little bit of a dirty market to a certain extent because just buying offsets really doesn't help the problem. It needs to be emissions reduction to the extent feasible. There's always going to be some emissions you can't avoid. Midstream, maintenance, blowdowns, there's always going to be emissions in our industry. But then buying offsets to get down to net zero. It's an entirely voluntary market. There's various exchanges out there that have different forms of offsets you can buy. The offsets vary in price depending on the price of carbon, but it's a fascinating market. Methane performance certificates, again, something I knew very little around, but S&P and other companies out there really trying to monetize or incentivize emissions reduction. So S&P, I didn't realize satellites were so ubiquitous, but apparently S&P has a satellite as well. They're going to launch into space and measure emissions at various basins. The idea being they're going to come up with a basin-wide, here's the threshold emissions for this basin. So let's just say it's 0.5% methane intensity for the Marcellus. Companies that are below that, they're going to create a credit-based mechanism where if you can prove that you're below that 0.5%, you can trade that reduction. So if you're at 0.2, you get that 0.3 carbon credit, and that's something you can trade for net zero goals, for other goals, for people to reduce. So again, I told you I was going tip of the iceberg, probably not a great explanation as to how this works. It's very, very detailed, but the idea is there's a growing world of sort of market-based mechanisms to incentivize companies to reduce emissions, and those companies that are leading the way on this are playing around in these markets and making a little bit of money on the side. So this is just a more detailed overview as to how the methane performance certificate works. Essentially, as I said, a baseline is set. If you can prove emissions below the baseline, below a certain threshold below the baseline, then you can get credits for your reduction. So just a little plug about Project Canary and what we do. I mentioned that our goal is to enable the long-term viability of the industry. We have two core services, both upstream and midstream. Our first is what we call our climate assessment. This is our certification program, where we look at an operator's engineering, their operations, and what impacts that has on air, land, water, community. Air being the main focus of what we do. We don't get too much into the land and social side of things, but we'll give an assessment, we'll give a rating. So if you're an upstream company, a midstream company, you have your what are already responsible operations, hopefully, certified as being responsible, which is something that has market impact from an investor perspective. If there's pension funds out there that are looking at, well, where do we want to park our money? Who are we going to divest? Who are we going to keep our money in? It can have impact from that level. If you're out raising money, if you're out going through permitting processes, can have a benefit too. Another thing that is of interest in terms of the market driving where the industry is going, sustainability-linked financing is something that's of interest in terms of banks, not just lending, but using lending, I guess, as a source of good in the sense of I'll give interest rate reductions based on commitments to meet ESG goals and actually satisfying those goals. So if you're a midstream company, business model is borrow a lot of money to build infrastructure. Many midstream companies carry a lot of debt, a lot of ongoing interest expense. If you can reduce the interest rate through commitment to ESG, there's probably some savings to be had. And then the other thing we do, continuous emissions monitoring. So mentioned that previously. Again, various different types of monitoring. We truly believe the best form of monitoring is continuous where it makes sense. And high fidelity. Our monitors, we have a whole suite of monitors, but we use a laser-based monitor that gives you the most actionable data. Probably the only thing worse than not monitoring your facility is monitoring your facilities with bad monitors, because therefore you're flying even more blind. You think you have good data, maybe it's not data. Somebody comes in with a satellite, a FLIR camera, some other form of measurement, and suddenly you're caught with your pants down because you think probably shouldn't have said that, but you think your emissions at a certain level and they're actually a lot higher. So I told you I'd try and keep this quick. That's me back when I had a decent haircut. If you guys want to carry on the conversation at cocktail time or afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, just skimming the surface here, but happy to talk through this in more detail with anybody who's interested. And also got some time here, so more than happy to take some questions. There we go. We got one.
Just, I mean, with the initial work you've done and your equipment and all that, what do you see as the primary areas for improvement, like along pipelines and gas processing plants? I mean, where is the big, you know?
Yeah, so with pipelines, we're seeing a lot of what companies are doing in switching out pneumatics from gas to air. Easy one to focus on. Another area where operators that we're working with have seen real value is some of the day-night seasonal variability between emissions, in the sense if you're doing your OGI, you're doing your walk-arounds, your AVO, maybe at the same time every day. Maybe you don't really understand what emissions are when the temperature is hotter, when it's cooler. And we've had operators come back to us and say, wow, we didn't realize that once the temperature hit whatever that threshold is, this gasket started leaking. So having the continuous emissions devices out there, really being able to drill in at a more granular level, when are emissions occurring, why are they occurring? Those are probably the two main areas. So with our goal, and you've seen this, number of companies are pursuing this as well, is to move from just, right now our monitors enhanced leak detection to detect fugitive emissions at lower thresholds and on a more continuous basis. But ultimately we're working towards truly quantifying the emissions. So going from what's the concentration of methane to what's the actual leak rate. So helping build this transparency between the industry reporting based on estimates to the industry reporting based on accurate measured data. There's many companies who are looking at this. We have a beta version of what we're calling quantification. It's based on algorithms and plume modeling. Easier to do in upstream when you don't have many obstructions that affect those plume models. So in upstream, we have a quantification program that's ready to go to really help companies report, ultimately work with regulators to report their emissions based off our devices. Midstream, more challenging, just the size of the facilities, the numerous emission sources you have, the buildings, it makes it more challenging. So we're looking at computational fluid dynamics in conjunction with plume modeling to come up with an algorithm whereby you can hopefully get to quantification. So there's companies out there right now, drone companies, who are telling folk they can quantify emissions. They have an error margin probably of 30 to 50%. In my opinion, that's useless. As I said, the worst thing than no data is bad data. So our view at Project Canary is we want to get this as low as we can go. So we're slow rolling, testing, making sure we get it right before we roll it out. Good question, though. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned earlier about making them more robust, so they're agreeable with the environmental NGOs and the industry and stuff. Isn't that a case of, the more you give them, the more they're going to take? I think maybe getting it monitoring more accurate is going to be more beneficial than trying to make something more robust, because the more robust you do it, they're just going to keep taking more and more and more. So they're anti-fossil.
Yeah,
get it to the coal industry. If you don't think they're not going to do it to the gas industry, you're crazy.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And there's people that are never going to like the industry, no matter how robust your certification is, no matter how well you're saying an operator is conducting their business. I think those are the folk we're less concerned about. Maybe some of those more reasonable folk who are understanding from an energy policy perspective, is it gas, is it renewables, what's the mix? To try and help build the credibility, the trust, transparency with people who will listen, because you're absolutely right. Many people won't listen, and Kinder Morgan has gone through on their Tennessee gas pipeline. They filed with FERC to create kind of trading hubs along the pipeline for certified gas to help build the market and allow some differentiation between certified gas and non-certified gas. And some of the environmental NGOs came in and said, certified gas is nothing more than greenwashing. It's lipstick on a pig. It's something we don't like. You're trying to make it look better, and it really is no better. Our view, obviously, is different. Every operator is prudent, but there's different levels of how operators conduct their business, and to the extent that we can help validate, bring attention to that for folk who will listen, that's our goal.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much.